Hey everyone, I'm Will, and I enjoy making electronic music under the name Lectronin. In this video, I'll be breaking down how I used the Roland SH-4d and the Novation Circuit Tracks in assembling and improvising a Berlin school track. If you enjoy this video, be sure to hit like and subscribe to my channel to be notified of future videos. So I was experimenting with a live setup with the two devices, the SH4d and the Circuit Tracks, including two other devices. So that included the SP-404 here, and right up here off the camera I have a circuit rhythm. Now I didn't involve the circuit rhythm in this particular track, although the audio was routed through it, but it was unaffected. I did use the lo-fi effect, so if we go over here into the effects settings, and you can see I have the lo-fi effect on the input effects settings on the SP-404, and that gives it a great sound. So even though the SP-404 is capable of a lot more, sometimes its effects on the overall signal chain is worth adding it to the performance. Now I'll talk a little bit about how I connected these devices here. I can just exit out of here. So I have the Circuit Tracks as my master clock device. So I go MIDI out from the Circuit Tracks into MIDI in onto the SH4d. Then Circuit Tracks, if I go into my settings here, MIDI 1 is assigned to channel 3, MIDI channel 3. MIDI 2 is assigned to MIDI channel 4. And so that goes out, MIDI channel 3 and 4, to the SH4d. And on the SH4d, channel 3 is assigned to tone 3, and channel 4 is assigned to tone 4. Now the audio out from the SH4d goes into the audio in on the Circuit Tracks, and it gets assigned in the mixer. So if I get out of here, whoops, gotta hit play there. It's assigned on the mixer on channels 1 and 2, where MIDI 1 and 2 are. It just comes right back in here, and it's controlled by these faders up here. And then the Circuit Tracks audio goes up to the circuit rhythm, passes through the circuit rhythm unaffected, and goes into the inputs of the SP-404 Mark II. And then that SP-404 goes out to my Tascam X8 audio recorder. For those of you who may not have experimented with improvising live music, it often involves a bit of preparation and predetermination of what material you're going to perform. In Berlin school, it can involve choosing your tonal center, that is the note, the key note of your scale, so like maybe C or E flat or whatever, the mode or scale that you're going to use, major, minor, Dorian, that kind of a thing, preparing your synth sounds, and then creating step sequence patterns that come in and out during the performance. It also often involves having a preconceived idea of the shape of your song, that is, the selection and order of your various sections. As with all improvisation, it's important to be in the moment and let your ear be your guide. Listen to what you hear and react. So, in preparation, I created a series of sequences that vary in rate and length. This results in some interesting interpolations that allow the sequences to continuously loop while consistently generating shifting patterns. So the first thing I did was create two sequences that involve pluck tones, and I did that right on the SH4d on tones 1 and 2. Now these are going to be sequenced directly on the SH4d, and so if I select that one right there, that's 2. This was, I think, the first one I created. So I'll bring that up. And you see it's a very short pattern. It's only 12 steps. And it's running at about 8th note rate, or 16th notes. So these are 8th notes that we're looking at here. The next one I created was on tone 2. Oops. And this used all 16 steps. You can see the notes lighting up down here. Now I kind of conceived of this as being centered on D, because if we go over here to the scales on the circuit tracks, you can see I've selected D for my scale, and it's actually a D mixolydian. And D mixolydian is essentially the same thing as G, but starting on D. So G would have G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G, and this is D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C, instead of C sharp would be a D major scale, so C, D. That makes it D mixolydian. Now, honestly, it's a little bit agnostic about both its mode and its tonal center, which kind of adds to the mystery of the Berlin School kind of sound. I also created two patterns for the pad sound on the SH4d on the Circuit Tracks, so MIDI 1. The first one is just this chord you see here. It's really like a open fourth. And the second pattern is just kind of a lower register version of that same interval, although except this time we're using fifths instead of fourths. And if you don't know what fifths and fourths are, it's just the distance between the notes. Like we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, fifth. And if we go back to the other one, one, two, three, four, fourth. Essentially D to G. So I also created a pattern for the bass, 3 patterns for the bass. So here's our first pattern. Down here it's actually pattern 3 in the selection, but this pattern just has 2 notes. And this is going at about 1/8 note rate, which means it's going every 12 steps. So we actually have 6 beats of one note and then 6 beats of the other note. And we had 4 beats of the pad pattern and also of the pluck 2 sequence. And we had 3 beats of the pluck 1 sequence. So you can see this interpolation that we're doing here. If we put them over each other, and then add in pluck 1. And bass is really important because we really perceive harmony from bass up. So you change the bass, you change the way we perceive all the notes that are sounding above the bass. So then over here in the Circuit Tracks, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to show you the other patterns I created for the bass. Let's get there. Go back to patterns, and we'll go check and look at pattern 2. Pattern 1 had 2 notes, pattern 2 has 3 notes. And now it's happening. Sorry, I need to correct myself. They were every 12 beats. Now they are 6, 6, and 12. 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I swear I can count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And this is really important later on because as I use the bass, I have to really time my scene selection to this 6-beat pattern. And then finally, the last pattern I created has 4 notes. And as soon as it ends here, you see how it's waiting to end. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Second note, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Third note, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Fourth note, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so those are the bass patterns that I created. Now, over here on the Circuit Tracks, I also created a kick pattern. It's just a simple 4 on the floor. and we take a look at that, see, it's just a simple 4 on the floor. I also created a snare pattern that really only comes in briefly in the improvisation. And it happens, these are eighth notes, so it's happening 1, 2, 3, 4, right on beat 4 of a, I guess like 12, that's 4, yep. 8, 12, yeah, it's a 12 bar loop, or 12 beat loop, I should say. And then hats. And they're coming on the ands, basically 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2. Actually, I'm including these as 1, but if we put it in with a kick, you'll hear it. So it's just coming opposite the kick. The other thing I did was I created another pad part on synth 2 of the Circuit Tracks. So we'll take a listen to that. And then there's a melodic part on synth 1 that I play live. But there's also a sequence to it as well, so if I unmute that, there's a bit of a call and answer effect going on with the sequence part. Now, one of the other things I can talk about too, get this playing again, I'm going to bring up that's my pad on the SH4d. Now, what I've done with this sound is I've assigned an LFO to it, and the FL rate is set to 4 bars. And it's modulating the filter about 33% here. And its type is set to just a random LFO. So that means over the course of 4 bars, it's going to randomly shift it in various directions. A very subtle kind of effect. But later on in the work, I'll switch the rate from 4 bars all the way over to 16th notes. And apply a little bit more of the LFO to the filter. This gives me a little more added interest as I reach the apex of the piece. And of course, along the way, I can just mess with the filter as it comes across the piece. Another thing I've done with the bass now is I do something similar where I have a sawtooth, a reverse sawtooth at 8th note rate, and eventually I bring it up from no application of the LFO to the filter. I just bring it up to about 36%, and that gives me like a pulsing 8th note bass line off of what is essentially from the Circuit Tracks, just long notes. And then I can bring that back out. So it's a nice, cool effect you can do there just by using an LFO. So the other thing I did was I created a series of scenes on the circuit track. Now scenes are going to be collections of groups of patterns. So in this particular pattern, we can look and see which patterns we selected. So we have the first patterns for the synth 1 and synth 2, first pattern for MIDI 1, third pattern for the bass, MIDI 2, and then the first pattern's up here. Really, I only use one pattern for synth 1, synth 2, drums 1 through 3. I use 2 different patterns for MIDI 1, which is the pad on the SH4d. I use 3 different patterns for MIDI 2, which is the bass on the SH4d. And so what a scene does is select among these. It also controls the mutes on the tracks. So if I go back to the first scene, it'll mute synth 2. And so I have these scenes that build in complexity. So more and more parts are brought in and they become more involved as I go along. And that helps me kind of construct the shape of the piece. And that shape is an arc form. And I created this arc by starting with simple scenes right here and progressing all the way to complex scenes over here and then skipping back to the simple scenes to end. So now I'll show you how I kind of did this piece here. The first thing I did was I faded in the plucks on the SH4d. The next thing I did is I faded in the pad. And then I finally faded in the bass. And that gives me all 4 SH4d tracks full in. Now again, I have to pay attention to this bass when it changes. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And by triggering scene 2, that brings in the pad on the circuit tracks. And then I went in and I selected the synth 2, which is the pad on the circuit tracks, and just adjusted the filter up a bit. Brought it in a little bit more. And then something similar over here by bringing up the filter on the SH4d. So that brings up the filter on the SH4d pad. And then I go back here to the mixer and get ready to trigger scene 3. And that brings in the kick. It also muted the pad on the circuit tracks. Then I brought down the filter on the SH4d pad. And get ready to trigger scene 4. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And that unmutes the hat sound. And also changes the bass of the second pattern. And now we're in the 3-note bass pattern. And then I went in and adjusted a little bit more on the pad of the SH4d. And get ready to launch scene 5 here. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 3. And that brings the pad back in on the circuit tracks. So I go over to synth 2 and I bring up a little bit of the filter, bring up some of the effects, and bring up some of the modulation. Now, I don't recall what the modulation and the effects are assigned to, like what these macro knobs are assigned to in the synth itself, but I like the results. The Circuit Tracks really is a black box when it comes to synthesis. Unless you use Novation's component software to open up the details of your pack, you don't really know what it's doing other than just trying to listen and guess at what it's doing. So I then went over to the to the SH4d and brought up the pad a little bit. And I get ready to unmute, or to trigger scene 6. Two, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that enables a snare that comes in on beat 4 of a 12-bar loop, or 12-beat loop. Keep saying bars. And it also gives us the 4-note variation of the bass part. Then I brought down the filter on the SH4d pad. Now, what I did next is I wanted to go into Synth 1 and start improvising a melody. Unfortunately, what I did was I hit the mute button. Let me go back and bring that up a little bit. And so I just quickly hit the mute button off, and then did it again. Because one of the secrets in improvising is to duplicate your mistakes. If you do it once, do it again to show that you meant to do it the first time, and then nobody will know. And the only reason you would know is because I told you. And then eventually I went over to Synth 1 and actually I brought up the track and started improvising a melody. And so, whatever I was doing, and quite honestly, I don't remember exactly what I was doing because I was improvising, I tried to replicate what I was doing. So if I did a little lick like this, and then I followed it with a lick like this, then I try and reproduce this lick again, and then vary this one. And then eventually, came in and started modulating the filter manually. So yeah, the trick in improvising a melody is to kind of stick with 1, 2, maybe 3 ideas, and then try to play with them, vary them, develop them. So the next thing I did was I brought up the filter on the SH4d pad, brightened it up a bit, and then I moved over to the Tone 2 pluck and brought up its filter. And then I get ready to trigger the final scene 7, which is going to unmute the lead sequence on track 1 of the circuit tracks. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now I continued to play a little bit with the filter on Tone 2. And this was the time I decided to go over to the pad and employ that little trick with the LFO. So I brought the rate up to 1/16 and increased the filter application. So applying the LFO to the filter. And then I moved on to the bass and did that same trick with the filter where I create those 1/8 notes. applying a little more, kind of lifting the cutoff here, makes it a little more distinct. There we go. Sounds a little better. So this was the apex of my arc. So if we're going from here, we're now at the top of the arc. So for here, I'm going to try and bring things back. So the first thing I did was I went over to the pad on Circuit Tracks and kind of reduced it like that. And then I went over and reduced the LFO applied to the, oh, that bass is getting aggressive there now. It's got a little free range there. So I reduced the rate, a little bit of the cutoff, and then the rate. And then kind of reduce the application of the filter. Then the next thing I did was I went over to the filter, the pad on the the filter on the pad. Open it up a bit. Just add a little interest, reduced it, and then turn my attention back to the bass, and then brought it back to nice long notes by taking the filter out. Or sorry, the LFO applied to the filter. Bring that cutoff down a little bit too. So if I go back here, I go back to scene 5, which actually I think I'd already done by this point. And that's where that and now we have the pad is out on synth 2. Well, I guess it's still there, but I've reduced the and that brings it back in just a little bit. So it's in, but it's kind of muted. Start bringing down the filter on the pad on this SH4d. Sorry, there's a lot of stuff that I did here. And then so the next thing was going to be triggering scene 3. 3, 4, 5. And go back to mixer. And so that brought out, oh, I forgot, you know, and I forgot where I did this, but somewhere in this whole mess, I'd actually taken out the, I took out the plucks here. And so now that I've reduced down to this, I brought them back in. And then finally, I triggered scene 1, which is to take out the kick. Two, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And at this point, I start fading out the remaining elements. First with the bass. Then with the pad. Then with the first pluck, leaving only the second pluck, and then eventually the second pluck. And that ended the track. So I hope you found this breakdown helpful. If you did, or if you have any questions, please let me know down in the comments. Thank you for watching. See you next time.